3 women were cast out in winter until a Lakota warrior showed them how to survive. The winter had come earlier that year than anyone expected. The plains stretched endlessly under a thick layer of snow, turning the world into a cold, white silence. The wind howled across the open land, carrying sharp flakes that stung the skin and chilled the bones. It was a place that could swallow a person whole if they were not careful. Yet it was here that 3 women found themselves, abandoned and alone, struggling to survive against the bitter cold. Each of the women had come from very different lives, and each had a story that brought her to this harsh place. The first, a woman named Eliza, had recently lost her husband. She had lived quietly in a small settlement, helping neighbors and tending her modest garden. When tragedy struck, the people around her whispered behind closed doors. They said she was unlucky, cursed even, and they could not take the risk of harboring someone who brought misfortune. One morning she had been told to leave, her home stripped of warmth and companionship. She carried only a small bundle of belongings, mostly clothing and a few simple tools, and stepped into the snow, her heart heavy with grief and fear. The second woman, Miriam, had fled an abusive household. Her life before had been full of tension and sadness, where every day brought fear and uncertainty. She had made the difficult decision to leave, running through forests and fields until she reached the outskirts of the settlement. She hoped to find safety among strangers, but instead, she found rejection. People were suspicious of newcomers, and a lone woman with no connections was seen as a burden. They told her to move on and never look back. Miriam had nothing but determination and a will to survive, yet the cold and the unknown pressed against her like a heavy weight. The third, a young traveler named Lila, was separated from her family during a journey to visit distant relatives. She had been excited at first, imagining new places and friendly faces, but the winter storm had caught her off guard. Roads were blocked with snow, rivers were frozen and dangerous, and the towns she came across were wary of strangers. She had hoped for shelter and warmth, yet she too was turned away. Lila carried a small satchel with some food and a thin blanket, but the winter's bite was stronger than anything she had imagined. The 3 women met by chance at the edge of a frozen creek, where the snow was slightly thinner and the trees provided minimal protection from the wind. At first, they were wary of one another. Each had been alone for so long that trusting another person seemed impossible. But as they shared their stories in whispers over the sound of the wind, they realized they had something in common: survival. They had been abandoned, left with no one to help them, and the winter would not wait for them to gather courage. They decided to stick together. There was strength in numbers, and even small acts, like sharing warmth or dividing the little food they had, made the day more bearable. They began walking slowly, searching for anything that could provide shelter. The snow was deep, sometimes reaching their knees, and every step was exhausting. The cold seeped through their thin clothing, making their fingers and toes ache. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, and their breath came in small, visible puffs that quickly disappeared into the frosty air. As they walked, they saw the first signs of nature's harsh rules. Tracks of wolves crossed their path, reminding them that they were not alone in the wilderness. A fallen tree offered a small bit of shelter, and they huddled beneath it for a few hours, trying to conserve warmth. They shared a piece of bread broken into tiny slices and drank slowly from a small stream, which had frozen in parts but still offered some liquid. Each act of survival was a lesson in patience, careful observation, and quiet courage. Despite the cold and hunger, the women noticed small signs that gave them hope. Birds huddled in trees, their feathers puffed against the cold, offering clues about where to find food. Tracks of deer or rabbits in the snow showed paths where animals moved, which might lead to safety or nourishment. Even the way snow gathered around certain rocks hinted at natural windbreaks that could serve as temporary shelters. Little by little, they began to read the land, understanding that survival depended not only on physical strength, but also on observation, intelligence, and careful planning. As the sun set, the cold deepened, and the sky turned a soft purple with streaks of red. They realized they needed to make camp before darkness fully fell. Together, they dug a shallow pit in the snow, lined it with branches and leaves, and huddled close together. Their bodies shared warmth, and their whispered words told stories of homes left behind, dreams of future safety, and the small comforts that reminded them of humanity. That night, even in the cold, they found a sense of solidarity they had not felt before. Though the women were strangers to one another, a bond was forming. Each brought unique skills and experiences. Eliza knew how to create simple traps and identify edible plants. Miriam was strong and resourceful, able to carry heavy loads and scout dangerous terrain. Lila, though young, had keen observation skills and a natural instinct for understanding patterns in nature. Together, they became more than the sum of their parts. They were a team, learning quickly that survival required trust, cooperation, and courage. Yet the winter was relentless. Storms came suddenly, sweeping across the plains with icy gusts that knocked them off balance. Snow fell in thick layers, covering tracks and erasing paths they had carefully marked. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, making each step heavier than the last. Exhaustion weighed on their minds, and the fear of frostbite and exposure loomed constantly. At times, despair threatened to take over. Each woman faced moments of doubt, asking herself why she had survived this long, why she had been cast out, and whether there would ever be warmth or safety again. It was during one particularly harsh morning that they first sensed another presence. While searching for firewood, Miriam noticed footprints in the snow that did not match their own. They were fresh, careful, and deliberate. Someone had been here recently. The women froze, unsure whether to feel fear or relief. Their instinct was to hide, to remain invisible in case danger approached. But curiosity and cautious hope nudged them forward. They followed the tracks a short distance and found signs of someone who had been preparing for winter survival. A small pile of neatly cut branches, a cleared area that could serve as shelter, and faint marks showing how snow had been melted for water. The women exchanged quiet glances. Whoever had left these signs clearly knew the land well, someone who understood the winter's dangers. It was the first indication that they were not entirely alone, that help might exist in this vast, frozen wilderness. For the first time since being cast out, their hearts lifted with cautious hope. Perhaps they were not doomed to wander endlessly, cold and hungry, but could learn from this mysterious presence, or at the very least find safety nearby. As the night approached again, the wind howled with renewed intensity. The women huddled together under their makeshift shelter, their minds filled with questions about who the person might be, whether they were friend or stranger, and how this encounter could change the course of their survival. Though exhausted and cold, they fell asleep with a faint glimmer of hope, unaware that the presence they sensed was only the beginning of a journey that would test their courage, shape their spirits, and teach them lessons that went far beyond simply staying alive in the winter. They did not know that a Lakota warrior, wise in the ways of the land and skilled in surviving its harshest trials, had been watching over them. He understood the plains, the snow, and the storms, and he had seen many lives lost to winter's cruelty. But he also knew that these three women had something rare: resilience, determination, and a willingness to learn. And so, he waited. Patient, careful, and quiet, he prepared to guide them, to show them the skills and wisdom that might allow them not just to survive, but to endure and even thrive in the cold wilderness. And so the first night passed, cold, harsh, and lonely, but also a night of new beginnings. The three women, cast out and left to face the winter alone, had taken the first steps toward survival. Together they had shared warmth, observed the land, and learned the small lessons that might one day save their lives. Little did they know that their journey had only just begun, and that the guidance of the Lakota warrior would soon bring them hope, knowledge, and the strength to face the frozen world with courage. The next morning, the wind was still sharp, but the sun rose pale and weak over the frozen plains. The three women huddled together under the makeshift shelter they had built the night before. Their fingers and toes were stiff from the cold, and the thin blankets offered little comfort. Yet despite the discomfort, there was a quiet determination among them. They knew that surviving another day required careful planning and courage. Eliza was the first to speak, her voice breaking the silence.
"We can't stay here forever."
"The snow will only get deeper. We need to find a better place, somewhere that can give us shelter and food." Miriam nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. She had been restless during the night, worrying about the frozen streams and the tracks of animals they had seen the day before. "If we keep moving slowly, we might find something," she said. "But we have to be careful. The winter doesn't forgive mistakes." Lila, the youngest of the three, shivered and hugged her small satchel close. I just want to find some warmth," she whispered. The women gathered their few belongings, tucking the blankets, a small amount of food, and the few tools they had into their packs. Their steps were careful and deliberate as they moved through the deep snow, using tree trunks and rocks for balance. Each step was tiring, but they encouraged each other with soft words. The cold was relentless, but the thought of giving up was worse than frostbite or hunger. As they walked, they noticed signs in the snow that they had missed before. Small footprints crisscrossed the plain. Rabbit tracks, fox tracks, and faint impressions that might belong to larger animals. They learned to watch for changes in the snow's texture. Where the wind had swept it smooth, it was harder to see. But where it piled up in drifts, it often created natural windbreaks. Each observation was a small victory. They were learning to read the land, even as their muscles ached and their stomachs growled. It was during one pause to drink from a partially frozen stream that Miriam first noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the snow that did not match their own. They were deliberate and steady, showing careful steps over rough terrain.
"Someone's been here," she whispered, pointing to the tracks.
The other women leaned closer, their breaths fogging in the cold air. The footprints led toward a small cluster of trees, disappearing behind a snowdrift. Eliza's face lit up with cautious hope. Maybe it's someone who knows the land, someone who can survive here.
Lila's eyes widened.
"Do you think they can help us?" she asked softly. The thought of another person, someone skilled in survival, filled them with a mix of fear and excitement. For the first time since being cast out, they felt that perhaps they were not entirely alone in the wilderness. They followed the tracks carefully, stepping lightly to avoid leaving their own marks too clearly. The footprints led them to a small clearing where the snow had been cleared and piled neatly, almost like someone had prepared a small campsite. There were branches stacked for firewood, and the marks in the snow showed where water had been collected and melted. Whoever had been here knew how to live in winter. The women exchanged looks of wonder and relief. That evening, as they tried to make a small fire using twigs and dry grass they had gathered, they noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure emerged slowly from behind the trees. It was a man, tall and strong, with sharp eyes and quiet movements. He wore a thick, warm cloak, and his boots crunched softly on the snow. The women froze, unsure whether to run or stay. But the man raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm, and then spoke in a calm voice. "I've been watching," he said. "I can see you are trying to survive. The land is harsh, but it can teach you if you listen." His voice was gentle yet firm, carrying a confidence that made the women feel safer. "You are doing well for now, but winter is not patient. It will not wait for you to learn."
You need guidance. The women hesitated, but they could see in his eyes a kindness and knowledge that reassured them.
He showed them where to build a better shelter, using branches and snow to create walls that block the wind. He demonstrated how to gather dry twigs hidden under the snow and start a fire that would burn even in damp conditions. The women watched carefully, absorbing every movement, every instruction. It was the first time they had felt that survival might not just be about luck or endurance, but also about learning and skill. Over the next few days, the Lakota warrior stayed nearby, observing their progress without interfering too much. He left small signs, piles of firewood, carefully arranged stones to mark paths, and hints about where to find frozen streams safe to drink from. The women began to understand that survival was not just about immediate needs, but about planning ahead, noticing small details, and respecting the land's patterns. The warrior also taught them to watch animals for clues. Deer and rabbits moved carefully across the snow, and their tracks often led to food sources or safer paths. Birds, huddling in trees or flying low across the plains, indicated changes in the weather. Even the clouds and the wind could tell stories if one learned to observe them closely. The women began to understand that the wilderness was not a random, threatening place. It was a living system that could guide them if they paid attention. At first there were mistakes. Lila nearly slipped into a frozen stream while trying to follow rabbit tracks, and Miriam overexerted herself carrying firewood up a hill. Each time, the warrior would appear quietly, showing them safer methods and teaching patience. "Winter is not your enemy," he said once. "It is a teacher. Listen carefully, and it will give you what you need." The women began to take his words seriously, learning that careful observation and steady effort were more powerful than fear or desperation. Meals became small rituals. They learned to melt snow slowly over a low fire, mix it with bits of foraged food, and ration what little they had. Each meal was more than sustenance. It was a lesson in patience, planning, and gratitude. The women talked in whispers as they ate, sharing their thoughts and dreams. Despite the cold, they began to feel a sense of hope and purpose. They were no longer entirely helpless. They were learning, adapting, and growing stronger. The women also discovered the importance of rest and warmth. The warrior showed them how to huddle together under layered blankets, how to insulate the ground with leaves and branches, and how to keep their fire going through the night. Small acts, tucking scarves around their necks, sharing a warm hand, stacking firewood carefully, became critical. They began to feel a growing bond, not just with one another, but with the wilderness itself. One evening, as snow fell lightly and the wind had softened, the warrior approached them directly. "You have learned much," he said. "But the winter still holds challenges. You must trust yourselves and each other. You can survive, but only if you continue to observe, plan, and act together." The women nodded solemnly. They had come a long way in just a few days, yet they knew the hardest tests were still ahead. The quiet moments by the fire became opportunities for reflection. Eliza thought about her life before tragedy, realizing that grief had clouded her strength. Miriam understood that fear could be transformed into focus, that panic did not help survival. Lila discovered courage she never knew she had. learning that small, careful actions could save her life. The lessons were not only about staying alive, they were about self-discovery, resilience, and hope. As part 2 of their journey came to a close, the 3 women had survived several days in the harsh winter with the guidance of the Lakota warrior. They had learned small but vital skills: finding water, gathering food, making fire, building shelter, and observing the land. More importantly, they had learned to trust one another and the quiet wisdom of the world around them. Though challenges remained, they no longer felt completely alone or helpless. They had the beginnings of skill, courage, and hope. And in the distance, the plains stretched endlessly, white and cold, full of dangers and possibilities. The Lakota warrior remained nearby, watching, ready to guide them further, teaching them the ways of the land and preparing them for the trials that winter would bring. The women understood that the days ahead would test their strength, patience, and courage even more. But they felt ready together, and with the guidance of someone who knew the secrets of survival. The days passed, and the 3 women continued to grow stronger. But the winter was relentless. Each morning brought icy winds that cut through even their thickest blankets, and each night seemed longer and colder than the last. Yet they began to notice a change in themselves. Their hands were steadier when gathering firewood, their eyes sharper when spotting tracks in the snow, and their steps more careful and confident on the slippery ground. Survival was no longer just about fear. It was about skill and determination. One morning, as the sun peeked weakly over the horizon, the Lakota warrior finally spoke more directly. He had watched them for several days, observing how they worked together, how they used the skills he had shown them, and how they responded to the challenges of the land. Now he knew they were ready for more guidance. "Today," he said, his voice calm and steady, "I will show you how to survive, not just for a few hours, but for many days, even in the harshest winter." The women listened carefully, their faces a mix of curiosity, nervousness, and excitement. They had grown to trust the warrior, not just because he had shown them small acts of kindness, but because he knew the land in a way they could not yet understand. He showed them how to build stronger shelters, using snow to block the wind and branches to create a roof that would hold up under heavy snowfall. He explained how to collect water from snow without letting it cool them too quickly, and how to recognize safe areas for drinking streams. He taught them the importance of layering clothing and insulating the ground beneath them when resting. The body loses warmth quickly, but clever techniques can slow it, he said. He demonstrated how to use leaves, grasses, and even animal fur to line the ground and trap heat. The women practiced these methods, and slowly their shelters became warmer, more secure, and better able to withstand storms. Food was another lesson. The warrior showed them how to track animals carefully, explaining that every movement in nature could tell a story. A deer track might lead to food or danger. A rabbit's path could guide them to edible roots or safe water. He taught them how to create simple traps, gather nuts, and identify plants that were safe to eat. At first, the women were hesitant, worried about making mistakes, but with his patient guidance, they learned to recognize patterns, to observe without disturbing the land, and to act only when necessary. The warrior also taught them to move quietly through the snow. "Noise attracts attention," he explained. "It can scare animals away or draw danger to you." He showed them how to place their feet carefully, using the terrain to hide their presence, and how to listen to the sounds around them: winds through trees, cracks in ice, or distant animal calls. The women practiced tirelessly, and soon their movements became smoother, their senses sharper. They could move across the plains with caution, leaving barely a trace. Beyond practical skills, the warrior taught lessons about patience and observation. One afternoon he led them to a small ridge overlooking the plains. "Watch," he said, pointing to the horizon. For hours they observed silently as birds moved in the sky, a fox crossed the snow, and the clouds shifted. "Everything communicates," he explained. "The land, the animals, even the wind. If you learn to listen, it will guide you." At first the women were restless, wishing to do something active. But slowly they began to understand. Observation was survival. It taught them when to act and when to wait, when to rest and when to move. The lessons were not easy. The cold was unrelenting, and mistakes were dangerous. Lila once slipped while climbing a small hill and nearly twisted her ankle. Miriam overexerted herself carrying wood back to the shelter and became weak with exhaustion. Each time the warrior showed them safer methods, encouraging them to pay attention to their limits and to help one another. Slowly, the women learned to balance effort with caution, courage with patience. They discovered that survival was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and strategic. Nighttime brought new challenges. The wind would howl around their shelter, and the temperature would drop so low that even their layered clothing felt insufficient. The warrior taught them how to keep the fire going, how to stack wood in a way that it burned longer, and how to create a small windbreak to protect the flames. The women learned to huddle together for warmth, but also to conserve energy and strength for the next day. Each night, as they drifted into sleep, they felt safer than they had since being cast out, though the winter still tested their courage. As the days went on, the women began to notice changes within themselves. Eliza, who had once been quiet and withdrawn after her loss, found a sense of purpose. She took pride in building shelters, gathering firewood, and helping the others learn the skills they needed. Miriam, who had been strong but fearful of the unknown, discovered confidence in her ability to handle challenges, even when exhaustion pressed on her. Lila, the youngest, found courage she never knew she possessed, moving carefully through the snow and helping to spot signs of animals or safe paths. Together they grew into a team, each contributing their strengths and learning from the others. The warrior also taught them about resilience in the face of setbacks. One day, a heavy snowfall covered their tracks and partially collapsed a section of their shelter. The women were discouraged, believing that all their effort had been wasted. But the warrior calmly guided them to repair the damage, showing that setbacks were part of learning. "Winter is patient," he said. "It will challenge you again and again, but every time you recover, you grow stronger." The women learned to view mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to improve. Meals became moments of shared learning. The warrior showed them how to melt snow slowly over a low fire, mix it with edible roots or bits of preserved food, and ration it carefully. Each meal was small but nourishing, teaching them the value of patience and careful planning. As they ate together, they spoke of their pasts, sharing stories of family, home, and dreams. In the cold and harsh wilderness, they found warmth in companionship and hope in shared knowledge. One morning, after a particularly icy night, the warrior gathered the women together. "You have learned much," he said, "but survival is more than fire, food, and shelter. It is trust, courage, and understanding the land as a living teacher. You must continue to work together and believe in yourselves." The women nodded, realizing how far they had come since being cast out. They were no longer helpless, lost, or hopeless. They had skills, knowledge, and the beginnings of confidence. They had learned to respect the winter, not just fear it. The lessons also touched their hearts. They began to understand that survival was a shared journey. Each woman had something the others needed: wisdom, strength, observation, or hope. Together they were stronger than any storm or snowfall, and the presence of the warrior was not only a guide, but a symbol of patience, knowledge, and resilience. His quiet confidence inspired them to trust their instincts and rely on each other. By the end of Part 3, the women had transformed from frightened, abandoned travelers into capable, resilient survivors. They could build shelter, make fire, find water, gather food, and move quietly through the snow. They had learned patience, observation, and trust, not only in each other, but in the land itself. Though the winter was far from over, they no longer felt entirely at its mercy. They had the knowledge and courage to face the challenges ahead. And the Lakota warrior, always nearby but never intrusive, continued to guide them. He knew that the harshest tests were yet to come, storms, deeper snow, and moments of danger. But he also knew that the women had grown stronger with each lesson. They were no longer passive travelers. They were active learners, capable of surviving the winter through skill, patience, and determination. The plains remained white and cold, stretching endlessly into the horizon. But the three women had discovered a new power within themselves. They were no longer simply victims of circumstance. They were survivors, learners, and partners in a journey that would teach them courage, resilience, and the quiet strength of unity. Each day they faced the winter with a growing confidence, ready to meet the challenges that lay ahead. The winter grew harsher with each passing day. The wind had a sharper edge now, cutting through layers of clothing and biting at any exposed skin. The snow deepened, making travel more exhausting and every step a battle against the cold. The three women, who had once been scared and hopeless, now moved with a quiet determination. They had learned much from the Lakota warrior, the ways of fire, shelter, food, and observation, but nothing could fully prepare them for the storm that was coming. It began one morning as they were breaking camp near a small ridge. The sky, clear only moments before, darkened rapidly. Heavy clouds rolled in from the north, thick and gray, carrying the promise of a relentless snowstorm. The wind began to pick up, rattling the branches and whipping snow into their faces. The women paused, feeling the tension in the air. Miriam, who had become the strongest physically, hugged her arms around herself. "This storm, it's coming fast," she said, her voice tight with concern. The Lakota warrior observed silently for a moment, then spoke calmly. "We must prepare. The storm will test your skills, patience, and courage. We will not fight it. We will survive it together." His calmness gave them reassurance. He led them to a small depression in the land, a natural windbreak, and began showing them how to reinforce their shelters quickly. Using snow, branches, and grasses, he taught them to create walls and roofs that could withstand the force of the wind. The women worked together, their hands stiff and numb, but their focus sharp. As the storm arrived, the wind howled like a living thing. Snow whipped across the plains, blinding and relentless. The women huddled inside their shelter, their breaths visible in the icy air. The Lakota warrior sat nearby, showing them how to manage their small fire so it would continue to burn despite the moisture and wind. He instructed them to use small twigs first, then gradually add larger branches, maintaining warmth without consuming all their fuel too quickly. The storm raged for hours, and the women felt the full weight of winter's power. It was cold beyond imagination, and the snow piled high against their walls. Every sound was magnified: the creaking of branches, the whistle of the wind, the shifting snow. Lila shivered uncontrollably, and for a moment she feared she might not make it through the night. But the warrior's presence and guidance gave her hope. He showed her how to cover herself properly, how to adjust the fire, and how to stay calm. Each lesson was a lifeline, and slowly she regained her courage. Outside, the world disappeared into white. The plains, once a place of endless horizon, became a wall of snow and wind. The women could hear the storm pounding against their shelter, a reminder of nature's immense power. Yet inside, there was a sense of control. They knew how to stay warm, how to conserve energy, and how to ration their food. They worked together to check the fire, move snow that threatened to collapse the shelter, and encourage one another. Each act, no matter how small, was critical for survival. The storm also tested their resourcefulness. At one point, a branch supporting the shelter cracked under the weight of snow. Miriam quickly replaced it, following the warrior's earlier instructions. Eliza gathered more twigs for the fire, while Lila helped reinforce the walls with snow and grasses. The teamwork they had developed over the past days became their greatest strength. They relied on each other's knowledge and courage, understanding that survival was impossible without cooperation. Hunger and exhaustion pressed on them as the hours passed. Their small rations of food were nearly gone, and the cold made it difficult to keep energy. The warrior reminded them to eat slowly, conserve strength, and use the fire efficiently. "Every action matters," he said. "Do not waste energy, and trust that patience will see you through." They followed his advice, sipping small amounts of water, sharing tiny pieces of preserved food, and taking turns resting while others tended the fire. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day. The women faced moments of fear when the wind howled so loudly they could barely hear one another. The cold was relentless, and fatigue made every task harder. Yet they also discovered their own resilience. Lila, who had once doubted her abilities, found herself moving confidently through the shelter, adjusting the fire and checking the walls. Miriam, who had always relied on physical strength, learned patience and careful planning. Eliza, who had once felt hopeless after her loss, discovered leadership and the ability to guide the others in practical ways. The warrior stayed calm and steady, teaching without commanding, guiding without rushing. He showed them how to listen to the wind and snow, how to recognize subtle changes in the storm, and how to anticipate dangers before they became critical. Each lesson built not only their skills, but their confidence. They realized that survival was about more than just knowledge. It was about composure, observation, and trust in one another. As the storm finally began to ease, the women emerged from their shelter cautiously. The world was transformed. Drifts of snow covered the plains, tree branches hung heavy with ice, and the cold was still biting. Yet the women felt different. They had faced the storm together, survived the long hours of wind and snow, and come out stronger on the other side. They had learned to work as a team, to rely on one another's strengths, and to respect the power of the land. The warrior led them to a small stream nearby, showing how to find water even after the heavy snowfall. He demonstrated how to melt ice safely, avoid dangerous currents beneath frozen surfaces, and find hidden signs of life in the snow. The women followed carefully, their senses sharper than before. They noticed subtle tracks, faint shadows, and small movements that revealed where animals had passed or where hidden dangers might exist. Every observation was a lesson in survival, every step a practice in patience and skill. Over the following days, the women began to practice what they had learned more. They built shelters stronger and more secure than before, moved quietly and safely through the snow, and found small sources of food to supplement their rations. Each day was a test, each challenge a chance to prove their skills. The storm had been the harshest trial yet, but it had shown them what they were capable of: resilience, courage, and the ability to endure even the most severe conditions. The experience also brought a deeper bond between the women. They shared stories, comforted one another during moments of fear, and celebrated small successes together. Eliza encouraged Lila when she felt weak. Miriam guided the group through tricky terrain, and Lila used her sharp observation to notice details the others might have missed. The winter, which had once seemed merciless and isolating, had become a teacher, shaping them into a team capable of facing incredible challenges. The warrior reminded them constantly that survival was not about defeating nature, but about understanding it. He explained that the storm had been a test of more than skill. It had tested their patience, their courage, and their ability to work together. Nature gives challenges, he said. Those who listen, learn, and act carefully can endure. Those who rush or panic will be defeated. You have endured because you learned to respect it, not fight it. By the end of Part 4, the three women had faced winter at its fiercest and survived. They were stronger, wiser, and more confident than ever before. The storm had tested every skill they had learned from the warrior, from building shelter and making fire, to moving quietly, rationing food, and observing the land. They had endured exhaustion, hunger, fear, and the relentless cold, and they had come through as capable, resilient survivors. The plains stretched endlessly around them, white and cold, yet the women no longer felt powerless. They had the skills, the courage, and the knowledge to continue their journey. They had learned to respect the land, to trust one another, and to listen to the wisdom of the warrior who guided them. The storm had been harsh, but it had transformed them, revealing the strength and resilience that lay within each of them. The Lakota warrior looked at the women with quiet pride. He knew that the greatest challenges were still ahead, but he also knew that they had grown remarkably in courage, skill, and unity. They were no longer frightened, abandoned travelers. They were survivors capable of facing winter's trials with wisdom and determination. The women had learned not only to endure, but to thrive in the harshest conditions, and that strength would carry them forward into the days to come. Spring slowly crept over the plains, bringing warmth and light to a land that had been cold and merciless for months. The snow, which had once covered everything in a blanket of white, began to melt, revealing the frozen earth beneath. Streams, once trapped in ice, flowed freely, and the wind no longer bit with the same sharpness. The world was changing, and so were the three women who had faced winter's harshest tests and survived. For Eliza, Miriam, and Lila, the journey through winter had been more than a fight for survival. It had been a journey of self-discovery, courage, and growth. Each morning as they stepped into the sunlight, they could feel the strength they had gained coursing through them. No longer were they frightened, helpless women cast out into a world that seemed determined to reject them. They had faced storms, hunger, exhaustion, and fear, and they had overcome all of it. The Lakota warrior, who had guided them patiently through every challenge, now stood quietly, watching them as they moved through the thawing plains. He had taught them not only how to survive, but how to read the land, understand nature's rhythms, and trust in their own skills. He had shown them the wisdom of patience, the importance of observation, and the power of courage. Now, as the snow melted, he could see that they were ready to carry that knowledge forward. The women had grown close over the months of shared struggle. They had learned to rely on one another in ways they could never have imagined before. Eliza, once quiet and grieving, had become a leader, guiding the others with steady hands and a calm mind. Miriam, who had been strong but fearful, had learned patience and foresight, able to anticipate dangers and help the group avoid them. Lila, young and uncertain at first, had discovered a keen sense of observation and courage that made her an invaluable part of the team. Together they were a unit, bonded by hardship and strengthened by shared victories. As they traveled across the plains, now dotted with melting streams and budding grass, they began to reflect on everything they had learned. They thought about the nights spent huddled in snow shelters, the hours of careful observation, the fires that had warmed their hands and hearts, and the small victories that had kept them alive. Each memory carried a lesson: the importance of teamwork, the power of patience, and the strength that comes from believing in oneself. Eliza remembered the first days of winter, when she had felt hopeless and afraid. She thought of the moment the three women had met, strangers brought together by circumstance, and how they had decided to face the wilderness as a team. She realized that it was their unity that had made survival possible. "We could not have done it alone," she said quietly to Miriam and Lila as they walked along a thawing creek. "Together we became stronger than the storm itself." Miriam smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. She thought of the storm that had tested them, the hours when the snow pressed against their shelter and fear threatened to overwhelm them. She remembered how the Lakota warrior had guided them, showing them how to move, how to observe, and how to remain calm. "It was not just the skills we learned," she said. "It was the way we learned to trust ourselves and each other." Lila, walking between the two older women, felt a new sense of confidence. She had faced exhaustion, hunger, and fear, and had discovered reserves of courage she had never known existed. She had learned to move quietly, observe carefully, and make decisions that could save lives. "I never thought I could do this," she said softly. "But now I feel like I can face anything." The warrior, watching them speak, said nothing, but his eyes reflected a quiet pride. He knew that the lessons he had given were only the beginning. The women now carried knowledge, strength, and resilience within themselves. They had learned that survival was more than a physical skill. It was a mindset, a harmony with nature, and a trust in one's own abilities. The cold and storms had tested them, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and braver than they had ever imagined. As they continued to move through the plains, they began to encounter signs of life returning after the winter. Birds sang in the trees, fresh green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, and animals that had hidden during the snow emerged to search for food. The women watched and learned, noticing the subtle signs that indicated where food and safety could be found. The warrior encouraged them to pay attention to these signals, explaining that nature continued to teach lessons even after the storm had passed. The journey also brought reflection on their past lives. Eliza thought about her lost husband. Miriam considered the life she had left behind, and Lila remembered her family, whom she had been separated from during her travels. Each woman realized that the hardships of winter had not erased their past, but had instead given them a new perspective. They had learned resilience, patience, and the ability to face fear with courage. They understood now that survival required not only physical strength, but also mental and emotional fortitude. One afternoon, the warrior led them to a small hill overlooking the plains. He asked them to sit quietly and observe. "Look at the land," he said. "See how it changes? See how life continues. You have learned to survive winter, but you must also learn to live with it, respect it, and take lessons from it." The women watched as the snow melted into streams, the ice gave way to water, and the first flowers began to push through the earth. They felt a deep sense of connection to the land, understanding that survival was part of a larger relationship with nature, not simply a fight against it. As the days of early spring passed, the women prepared to leave the wilderness and return to the world beyond the plains. They packed their belongings, reinforced their knowledge, and reflected on everything they had learned. The warrior had shown them the skills to survive, the patience to endure, and the courage to face fear. But the women now carried the lessons within themselves. They were no longer dependent on guidance. They were confident, capable, and resilient. Before parting ways, the women thanked the Lakota warrior for his guidance and wisdom.
We could never have survived without you, Eliza said, her voice filled with gratitude.
Miriam and Lila echoed her sentiments, expressing how much they had grown through the journey. The warrior smiled quietly, nodding. "The strength was always within you," he said. "I only showed you how to see it." As they descended the hill, leaving the snow-covered plains behind, each woman felt a sense of renewal. The harsh winter had tested them in every way, physically, mentally, and emotionally, but it had also revealed the courage, resourcefulness, and resilience within them. But they had learned to trust themselves, to work together, and to respect the land that had tested them so severely. They had survived, but they had also grown, changed, and discovered a deeper strength that would remain with them forever. In the days that followed, the women returned to settlements, families, and lives that were waiting beyond the wilderness, yet the lessons of winter remained. They moved with a confidence born of experience, a patience forged in hardship, and a quiet understanding of the strength that comes from facing fear and uncertainty.